Good day and welcome back to Elementary 72 Gaming. Before I get into this video, I'd like to ask you all to please leave a like or comment on my video and consider subscribing to my channel. Now, I'm going to be going through a little bit of a history of raids within the game. Now, I'm actually chasing after gear for getting ready for the raid in this video. So let me just talk a little bit about the raids in general. And I'm going to be talking about raids from the point of Destiny 1 all the way up to the point right now where we are in Destiny 2. So the first raid that ever launched was Destiny's Vault of Glass. Now, Vault of Glass was a team-orientated activity. It required a small amount of communication, but it originally was very difficult for players to do because there were multiple mechanics and multiple things that people had to handle. Number one, there were bosses and hard enemies to defeat, and this was a very new thing for players. Players had just barely completed the story, and this was the 10th or 14th day of the game, and all of a sudden, this massive activity came out that you needed to complete to progress to the end of the game. It took several weeks for most of us to complete it, even those who would later become masters of the raids. So here's exactly how the raid went. The first part was basically you standing on a plate until you operated a conflux. Now this conflux would grow and complete itself over several minutes, and once it was done, the gate to the Vault of Glass would open for you, and then you would go inside, collect your first chest, and all of this would then start to progress as you continue down. Now, once you continue down the path through a little bit of a jumping puzzle, a little bit of a maze, you would end up at another point in the game where you're in a large open area. And this is where you faced off against one of the first enemies, the Templar, if I'm correct. I'm not exactly 100% sure. But nonetheless, the Templar would spawn, and you would then have to defend these confluxes. And your first conflux was right in front, so you defend it. Then the conflux would disappear, and you'd have to defend two confluxes, one on either side, on the left and right. And then you would have to defend three confluxes at the exact same time. Now, in between this defense protocol, when you had completed your defense, the Templar would spawn and he would rain fire from the center. And he really fired heavy, and there were ads for you to clear all the time. If ads sacrificed themselves at the confluxes you had to defend, your team would end up wiping after a few of them had been sacrificed. So you had to make sure that no sacrifices came through, in other words, to complete this mission basically very efficiently. And once you had gotten through this type of a phase, the next thing that had to happen was you had to run away from what was called legions. Now, these legions would explode and leave this essence on the ground. This essence would mark you for negation by the Templar. And in the center was this well of light that you had to jump into and get yourself cleansed if you were ever hit by this essence. And slowly or surely you would go through this, but that well would only spawn when the Templar was around. So you had to take the damage and the high risk route of jumping into the middle of the most populated area with ads. A lot of players found ways around this, and strategies were made up to get through this phase very easy. Once these first three confluxes were completed, you would receive a chest, and that would be the end of the first phase. Now, moving on from this, a second phase would start. Now, in this phase, you would have to kill something called oracles. These oracles would actually be the ones performing negation on you this time, because if you didn't destroy an oracle, they would negate your entire team instantly. So you had to destroy oracles, and they spawned randomly around the map. There were several of them in very key areas, and you had to shoot them to destroy them. Once they were destroyed, they didn't have the ability to negate you and pull you out of time. So once this was done, you would progress then to the next set of activities, and that would be the damage phase on the boss. Now, the Templar himself had a mechanic to him where he would teleport around the map to several different locations, and this is a very complicated situation, and this was the first time that a real hardcore element to your communication had to come in. In order to fight the Templar, you needed to gain an object called the Relic. And the Relic was basically this portion of light that was left behind by another Guardian who had died within the Vault of Glass. So you would grab onto it and you would have to cleanse your team of any type of negation effect that they had. So as they started to darken, you had to get in there, you had to cleanse them, you had to clear ads because ads were overwhelming you. And once you had so totally charged up the relic to the point where it had a super, you could blast the super at the boss and take down his shield. Now it was a one-shot attack. Now, the next thing that you had to do was the person with the shield had to move along within the map to find the next point where the Templar would teleport to, and they would have to cleanse that area. So they had to move to the next area, but it wasn't so easy to detect it because there were 5 areas where you could teleport to, and someone would have to tell you where the beam was. When you finally arrived on the beam, you drop your cleansing bubble and you would clear out his ability to teleport, which would keep him fixed, allowing you to do more damage to him. Now, once you reached a certain state on damaging the boss, the process of negation would start once more. You would have to continue hitting him till you finally destroyed him. Now, that was the base mechanic for the perfect run for that part of the run, which was beating the Templar. Once you had defeated the Templar, the next thing that would spawn was a chest that you would collect. And there were 2 routes through to the next part, which is the oracles. I'm not going to talk about the exotic chests or the secret routes, but if you followed the straight route where the gate opened, you would end up into another little lair, which was called the Gorgon's Lair. Now, the Gorgons were a form of very, very tough harpy that you could only defeat 1 or 2 before they became totally invulnerable. And you had to kill them before they completed a wipe effect if you ever got caught by them, and it took a full fire team just to destroy 1 Gorgon. So moving through this was how the coordination had to go. You had to sneak past all of them and sneak through a tunnel that led you up to this disappearing stairways. And they would appear and disappear, and if you jumped on them and followed them, you would eventually end up at the end of this long jumping puzzle where you would now open the gates to Pantheon. Pantheon being the last boss of the raid. But before you could get to Pantheon, you would have to defeat his Templar, basically. Whatever the name of that Templar was, I forgot. But anyway, you would go through, you'd open the gate, and you'd have to kill that Templar really, really quick. Now, once you kill that Templar, then the next stage of mechanics begin. So within the next stage of mechanics were 3 mechanics to note. You had to defeat the central conflux, which summoned you had to defend the central conflux, which summoned Pantheon. You had to work with opening portals, which were 2 separate little stations. You had to complete opening the station, open a gateway, a Vax gateway, so that players could get back when they were teleported. And it was done at random, so anybody could be teleported at any time, so people had to be able to move around. This is where communication became key within the raid. So the first conflux was in the center. You had to defend it against enemies approaching in. You needed 2 other guys to go and open the portals, and you needed 2 other guys to go and fetch the relics. Now there were there was the future and the past. Most people call it Venus and Mars because they look similar to those environments. So the future was a dead and dry place. It looked like Mars. The past was a green place. It looked like Venus. So basically that's how they used to describe it. And you had to go in there, pick up the relic, destroy the enemies inside, destroy the oracle. You had to destroy the oracles inside and leave that area and come out to the fight in the center. Now, once you came out with that relic, you had a lot of power and you could actually push away the waves. And once you had defeated all the waves of enemies and defeated the waves of minotaurs that would come out from the gates, you finally had completed the encounter. And at this point, you would get another reward chest. Now, the next point of this whole activity was for you to go and start off the battle with Pantheon. You'd have to go and open up both of the terminals again and have the portals active. At this point, Pantheon would be summoned in and you would have to start the final boss encounter. Now, this encounter contained 3 steps. First of all, it was the transportation, moving to and from the transportation. The second step was clearing ads around your transportation because there were special harpies that spawned that would explode and kill you instantly if they caught you. And last of all was collecting your relic from inside of the portal and destroying all the oracles. Only 3 teammates were transported at the time, leaving 3 teammates on the outside. And you had to have communication with everybody to know which portal you have to open. And as you open the portals, you then have the ability to fight on with the battle. Now, once you came out with the relic holder would sit in the center and open a massive bubble. Within the bubble, once you jumped in, you could do massive damage to Pantheon. And as you slowly dealt damage to him, you'd see that his health bar started to go down. Eventually, after a third wave, you finally got to the point where you could kill him. Now, in between the teleportation and the cleaning out of ads, you'd be caught in a bubble that you'd have to destroy in order to continue with your fight. If you didn't destroy the bubble and got out of it, you'd instantly die. So you had to destroy these bubbles and keep moving around. It made the whole fight a little bit more difficult. Now, once you had finally gotten through all of this and you went through all the cleansing from the person with the relic, there was a central point where everybody would jump on and fight Pantheon. I'm not going to talk about the glitches of dropping him off the map. Those are totally glitches. So you'd have to deal damage to him in 2 phases. Hitting him in the crit area was the best route, and players would use a lot of missiles, a lot of snipers to deal optimal damage to him. And once he was finally down, you finally had completed the first raid encounter. And this was the Vault of Glass. Now, moving on from this came the next season's encounter, that was Crota's End. Now, compared to the Vault of Glass, Crota's End plays a critical part to the story. Now, Vault of Glass isn't that critical to the story, but once you do it, it does hold some impact towards the future. Now, let's go through Crota's End. Crota's End required you to ascend down into the Dark Abyss, transverse the dark parts, and try and keep yourself from getting the burden of the darkness. Then build a bridge at the end of a long maze or a long labyrinth, and then cross the bridge and enter into the next part of your encounter. That was it. It was actually that simple. But the problem was you had to contend with 2 or 3 mechanics. One was the burden of darkness, which would slow you down so you couldn't jump or run, and you would have to sit at lamps that would explode after a set amount of time, so you could reduce that burden to increase your speed a little bit. And you would be swarmed with thralls and exploding thralls and knights along this entire fighting route, so you had to stay in combat throughout that entire time. And it was quite a long route, and there were holes and pits and rocks in the way, so you had to move around them, go around all of these obstacles while doing this maze at the same time. Once you reach the end, 2 powerful ogres would spawn, witches would spawn, knights would spawn, and depending on how you fought them off, made the difference in how fast your bridge actually completed its growth. Once the bridge was completed, you could then cross the bridge and enter into the next area. Now, the next area was a little bit more complicated. It had 2 totem poles and an extension for a bridge. Now, you could stand on the 2 totem poles, and you had to have 1 person on each of the totem poles and 1 person on the bridge. And then a sword bearer would appear and start to attack you. You had to defeat the sword bearer, get the sword, and cross the bridge that you had opened by standing on the central platform. Only the person with the sword could cross, and when they crossed with the sword, they had to defeat the berserker or gatekeeper on the other side, and that is the only way to defeat the gatekeepers with the sword. Then they would have to fight off on the other side until they reach 3 members. Once they reach 3 members, it was then their turn to open up the bridge for the player from the other side instead of those who are on the other side. So the mechanic would swap over to the opposite end. It also had 2 totem poles and the central bridge compartment. However, until 3 people were on the other side, you couldn't use this here, because if you tried to open the bridge or hold the totem poles, you'd instantly wipe. So you had to keep clearing ads and keep the area as clear as possible until your team crossed. Once your team crossed over, 2 ogres would spawn, and you would have to kill both ogres in order to move on to the next part of the activity. There were a ton of ads who would spawn, hive wizards, and knights would also spawn, both melee and boomer. So you'd have to kill them, and then you go on to the next part. The next part was a simple passageway. You had to destroy a shrieker and go through until you reach the drop into the final section, where you would eventually fight the boss. Now, in the final section was what you would call the Death Singers. Now, you had to destroy all the Death Singers. You had to destroy the Death Singer Erut and take out all of the wizards and all of the ads around in the area. Now you would go in, you would defeat a hive wizard, and you would destroy a shrieker in order to continue on to the next part, and you could finally deal damage to her. And that was the mechanic of that. Now, obviously, Shriekers had their own mechanic. When you destroy them, they let off some explosive devices that attempted to destroy you. You had to contend with all of this, destroy both sides, get into the center, and destroy Ryut. You had 110 seconds to actually complete this encounter, so just under 2 minutes to defeat her. Once she was defeated, then the soul of Crota, which was in the center in a big crystal, would transfer out into his soul world, into his throne world, and he would be summoned in the center. Now you would all gather onto a central platform, and this year would then start off the final boss encounter. Now, in the process of fighting Crota, you once more would be plagued with sword bearers. You had to destroy a sword bearer, pick up the sword, and fight Crota with the sword. It was the only thing that could damage him. But before you could fight him, you'd have to take down his shield and drop him to his knees. And this only lasted for about 10 seconds. So you had to hit him with the sword in that 10 seconds, get away from him, because any hit from him was an instant kill. And eventually, once you completed this, you had completed Crota's end. Now, at this point, these are the two biggest raids that had ever come out. Following this would be the Taken King. It has several massive mechanics to it. I'm not actually going to go through all of Taken King's mechanics because that is a much more difficult raid to talk about. It would take a whole video on its own. So you would go through the Taken King, which also had its own set of mechanics. And then after that, the next raid to launch in Destiny 1 was in the Rise of Iron in the Plague Lands. I'm forgetting the name of it. It was the Siva based raid with Exus as your final boss. Now, they all had a lot more mechanics in them. They introduced a lot of new methods to how you would do raids, and communication became key to getting it done faster and better. And weapon systems became very, very important in how you completed raids at this point. Now, moving on from there would be Destiny 2. Now, in comparison to Destiny 1's hardcore aspect that you had to learn those raid mechanics, Destiny 2's first raid was the Leviathan. Now, I'm actually going to just discuss the Leviathan. The Leviathan was a very basic activity. Kill the ads and transport the tokens inside. There was no wipe mechanic for your first encounter, which was the first room. Once you had completed this here, you would enter into the next room where you would either fight the bathers, the dogs, or you would do the labyrinth. So one of those three activities, and they were at random. Now, the dogs were a pretty straightforward activity. It had a similar aspect to Crota's End where you would go through the darkness. It had a similar DPS aspect where you had to kill 6 dogs, and it had a safe room where you could avoid the wipe mechanic. So you went through all of this, you completed the dogs, that was it. If you were doing the labyrinth challenge, not the labyrinth challenge, the race challenge, basically, it is a very, very simple challenge. You have several symbols, you have to open up parts for your runner, and you are told which symbols to shoot when it comes time to shoot. It was a very simple activity. You just had to be able to see where the runner was going, what was the whole idea behind it. Communication wasn't very important. It was very easy to figure out what to do. Then moving on to the next phase of it, you would all run through the maze, complete yours, dropping off yours artifacts in the center room, and once it was all dropped in, you completed that activity. Very simple. The bathers were also a very simple activity. You had to kill the bathers, collect and build up charge, and once all your charge was built up, you had to destroy lamps in a room. Once that was done, you moved on to the next activity. The last activity in the whole process of this mission was killing Emperor Callus, or the android of Emperor Callus. Also very, very simple in mechanics. 2 different sides of play over there, where you have the shadow world and the real world. In the shadow world, you have to go through small little mechanics telling everybody what to do in the real world. So basically, it needed that small amount of communication. And that was it. It was a very simple raid to do. It was way simpler than the original raids. It didn't have that many heavy mechanics involved. That's why it was so simple for people to complete. People completed the raid almost effortlessly. You killed Callus in a few minutes by players destroying what they would call heads from Callus's mouth, and once you had destroyed enough of it, you gained a boost in how much of damage you did. And at that point, you would start the damage phase on Callus. Everybody would be transported back into the room. You'd fight, people would be transported back to the Shadow Realm. You would transport out 3 guys again, and then you would start off that whole mechanical aspect all over again. So once all of that was done, it was a little bit more complicated. You had to call out symbols, and each person could only see one symbol. And you had to have 3 people in the room at a time. So at that point, we managed to defeat Callus. We went down, we collected the first reward. The second raid in Destiny 2 was also just as simple. If I'm correct, that is a Leviathan second raid. I'm forgetting what it was called. But nonetheless, it was very simple. The mechanics weren't very complicated. You went through it very, very easily. The last section was just a little bit tanky and a little bit complicated. Once more, very simple raid. Then was the Spire of Stars, 3 simple activities. I never completed the last, wait, no, I did complete the last phase on the boss there. And we even killed him in that one. I think it was the one before Spires of Stars. I think it was the Eater of Worlds. I didn't complete that raid. Now, the Crown of Sorrow, I never took part in myself. I heard that it introduced a few new mechanics, very similar to the original Destiny 1. Then moving on from that, there was within the period before Shadowkeep. Then came Shadowkeep's raid, which was the garden where you basically fought the Vax, the Black Garden. And once more, a very difficult encounter. It had a lot of mechanics in it. Once more, something that was relevant to the old Destiny mechanics. And now they have finally another heavy mechanic-driven raid, and that is the Crypt. Now, I know I may be missing a raid. If I am correct, I am missing a raid. Somewhere in there should be a raid that I'm missing. But right now is the Crypt. And the Crypt is also another heavy mechanic-based activity. I've currently only watched Carcass's flow on how things work. So I have a very basic understanding of it. And hopefully at the end of all of this, I will be able to complete all of the activities when it's finally time for me to go in. I might actually join into one of my friends to do this activity when I'm finally ready. So I hope that you all enjoyed this little snippet of me talking about the old raids from Destiny. Thank you all for watching. Have a good